so far we've talked about costs that are things that you pay for a power plant that you've built. So what is the monthly payment I have to make? What are the variable costs I pay if I operate the plant? What are my operation and maintenance costs for operating a plant? So these are all costs related to a plant I've already built. Now we want to talk about the costs we're going to think about if we're thinking about building a new power plant. So the first dimension of cost I want to talk about is the levelized cost of energy. And the levelized cost of energy, just to give you a sense of where I'm going here, the levelized cost of energy is sort of a long-run average cost of generating electricity. So the levelized cost of energy, the definition of the levelized cost of energy is the average cost per megawatt hour, and we're thinking about the cost over the lifespan of a power plant. So the average cost per megawatt hour of building and operating a generating plant over an assumed financial life and duty cycle. So we can think about if I build a power plant, say my 500 megawatt power plant, I have to make a guess as to how much that plant is going to operate. What is its average capacity factor going to be over the life of the power plant? And if it's operating at that average capacity factor, how much electricity would it generate over the course of its lifetime? So that's the total amount we would generate over the lifetime of the power plant. But then I have costs over the lifetime of the power plant. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the costs I have to pay to build and run this power plant over its entire lifetime and divide those costs by the total amount of electricity I would generate over the course of this power plant. And that's going to give me essentially the long-run average cost of generating electricity with a new power plant I might build. That's the levelized cost of energy. So what kind of things go into calculating the levelized cost of energy? Well, I need to know what my monthly payment is going to be, what my total cost of the capital cost of building and financing the power plant. Then I have fuel costs for running the power plant, my variable costs. So, and then I have fixed and variable operation and maintenance costs. I already talked about the capital costs. We also have financing costs. And then we have some assumed capacity utilization rate for the plant over the plant's lifetime. So we need to know all those things over the course of a plant's lifetime. But when we're building a plant, we don't know those things for sure, but we have to make our best guess on many of these things. So we're going to make our guess about future fuel costs, about the operation and maintenance costs we're going to face for this plant. We have to make assumptions about what do I think my average capacity factor is going to be over the life of the plant, and then what's it going to cost to build and finance the power plant. Once we know those things, then we can get a sense for, well, what kind of plant, if I build a plant now, what will its long-run average cost be? And so I can compare different power plants according to the average cost of operating them over their entire lifespan. So to make this easier to think about, we're going to break the levelized cost of energy up into two parts. That's the levelized fixed cost and the levelized variable cost. We can think about this as being the average cost of operating a power plant at a given capacity factor. So if we take a power plant, we have levelized fixed costs and levelized variable costs. We have the monthly payment we're going to be making, and that's constant over the life of the power plant in our example. And then we have our levelized variable cost, which is just the average variable cost we're going to face over the lifetime of the plant, assuming we're operating at some expected capacity factor. So our capital costs are fixed for the term of the loan, and we think of the term of the loan as being about 30 years, about the same amount of the same length of time we expect the power plant to operate. And so if operation and maintenance costs and fuel costs are likely to stay about the same once we adjust them for inflation, then the levelized cost of energy is actually just the average total cost of the power plant today. So if fuel costs aren't changing and operation and maintenance costs aren't changing, and that is after we adjust for inflation, then today's average total cost is really a reasonable measure of the levelized cost of energy. Oop. Wrong button. So let's think about the levelized cost of energy for a new plant, just to be a little more specific about it, so we have an example we can work with. We want to know the average total cost of operating a plant over its lifetime. So how do we figure that out? Well, we have to assume something about fuel prices. So I'm going to make an assumption that we don't have any particular reason to believe that fuel prices are going to go up faster or slower than the rate of inflation. So let's just assume that once we've adjusted for inflation, fuel costs are going to stay more or less the same over the lifetime of the plant. It doesn't mean the fuel costs are going to be constant. It means they're not going to go up much differently than the rate of inflation. A reasonable assumption to make about fuel costs. The cost of financing the plant are fixed. We write a 30-year contract for the plant. It's going to be a fixed monthly cost for the lifetime of the plant. That's a nice, easy thing to predict. Now, the next thing we have to do is that we have to make an assumption about how much this plant is going to run. Now, of course, this is something we don't know for sure. We have to, when you're building a power plant, you have some idea of, if you're able to write a contract for that power plant, say with a distribution company, then you know in advance what you'll be paid for the operation of that power plant. But for a merchant generator, for example, you may not know what the capacity factor of that plant is going to be for sure. You have some idea of how competitive it is with other plants in the market, how fast electricity demand is going to grow, and so you'll make an assumption about how much of the time this plant is going to be able to run. How much of the output of this plant are you going to be able to sell every month? Now you have to keep in mind every power plant has to have some downtime for maintenance, and so there's going to be part of your calculation of the capacity factor, but it's also going to depend on market factors. So what is the competition like? Will this plant get dispatched as much as you expect it will? And of course we know there are cases where a power plant gets built and then it operates at much lower than its designed capacity factor, and there are other cases where power plants get built and they run higher than their anticipated capacity factor. But when you're thinking about the levelized cost of energy, you have to make some guess about what that's going to be in the future. And so your expected capacity factor is going to be the capacity factor we use in thinking about the levelized cost of energy. The levelized cost of energy is the average total cost at the expected capacity factor for a power plant. And another way of saying this is that this is the long-run marginal cost of the power plant. So you could ask the question another way. You could say, what would I have to pay if I wanted to generate 1 additional megawatt hour? If I wanted to build a power plant that could generate 1 additional megawatt hour, what is that going to require? Well, it would require a slightly larger power plant. If I'm going to be running a plant at 80% capacity factor for its entire life, and I want to think about what would it take to generate 1 additional megawatt hour, it would take 2 things. It would take a slightly bigger power plant and additional variable costs over the course of the power plant. So the levelized cost of energy is what would it cost me to change the design of this power plant and run that different power plant enough so I get 1 more megawatt hour of energy. So the levelized cost of energy is the same as the marginal cost of generating 1 more megawatt of energy with this power plant over the course of its lifetime. I got to have a slightly bigger plant. It's got to run, burn a little bit more fuel, and so I add up those costs, and that's what it would take to get 1 more megawatt hour of electricity generated over the life of this power plant. Okay, we'll be talking about this. Oh, I have a picture of that here. So if you think about a plant as having a given average total cost, so we design a plant, it's a baseload coal plant or a baseload natural gas plant, 500 megawatt capacity. What do we think our average capacity, what is its average cost going to be? Well, in order to think about that, I've got to know how much it's going to run. I have my average cost curve, my average total cost, which are my fixed monthly payment plus what I think it's going to take me to buy fuel to run that power plant. So my average total cost is the sum of those 2 things, but it's going to depend on how much I run the plant because my average total costs are falling quite fast as I add my capacity factor, as I increase my capacity factor. So let's take a look at the graph we have of the levelized cost of energy. So here we have an assumed long-run capacity factor of 80%. We're going to be running the plant 80% of the time. That accounts for its competitiveness in the market, whether it has a it's under a power purchase agreement or not. It also depends on how much does the plant have to be down for maintenance activities. So if we are running this plant at an expected 80% capacity factor, then the average total cost of operating that plant at 80% is going to be, I think if I think back to the average cost we calculated before, if we think about our 500 megawatt plant, it's going to be something in the, we know it's going to be, well, here, if we look on this graph, it's going to be something on the order of, I don't know, it looks like $35. So if we're going to be running this plant at 80% on average for its entire lifetime, then the levelized cost of energy is going to be, at least for the picture I have, the plant I have pictured here, something around $35. That's the sum of its average fixed cost and its average variable cost over the lifetime of the power plant. Okay, so this is the levelized cost of energy. Remember, the levelized cost of energy, another way of thinking about it is, this is the cost of the marginal cost of adding 1 megawatt hour of electricity over the lifetime of the power plant, because this is the average cost of generating a megawatt hour over the lifetime of the power plant. And if we generate 1 more, we'd have to have a slightly bigger plant, we'd have to spend a little more on fuel, and this is what it would cost to add another megawatt hour.